What is up, all of you Dune fans and followers of Paul Maudib Usul? Dune Part 2 has now been released, and having done my spoiler-free review already, I thought it was a great time to do a deep dive video into this movie. I've now seen it twice, and I'm sure a lot of you guys can agree there's a lot to take in there. But another reason I wanted to sit down and do this is because I'm a massive fan of the original novel by Frank Herbert, and so today I wanted to break down Dune Part 2 as well as point out some of the differences that I noticed between the novel and the movie. But there will be full spoilers ahead, so there's your warning. And before we get started, make sure you smash like and subscribe if you're new here. I mean, you don't have to, just the Baron was telling me that if you don't, he's gonna send this like psychotic nephew that he has after you. I don't know. But Dune Part 2 is the second half to one story. So this isn't necessarily a sequel. There's a lot of people out there calling it a sequel. It's more of a Part 1 and Part 2, two halves to a whole. But just like Part 1, in Part 2, there are a lot of changes that Denis Villeneuve decided to make. And so I want to talk a little bit about those changes, just a few of the key ones that I noticed and kind of break them down just in case you guys didn't really know what was going on there. I do want to preface with the fact that I am not a Dune novel expert by any means. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that know this book front to back. I'm not claiming to be one of those people. I've just read the novel and I absolutely love it. But the first change I want to talk about, and this is kind of a hot button issue with some of the fans of the book, it's the Mentats. If you're not familiar with what a Mentat is, basically they're humans trained to mimic computers, kind of like human calculators, and dukes and barons and even emperors value them very, very highly. And Thufir Hawat is the Mentat for House Atreides, and we actually do see him in Part 1, but correct me if I'm wrong, we don't really see what happens to him at the end of Dune Part 1 and Denis Villeneuve's version, but in the book, he does play kind of a key role moving forward. He has a lot to do with the ending. There's also Piter, and he's the Harkonnen Mentat who dies in the room with Leto when Leto lets out that poison breath. And like I said, for some fans, the exclusion of them in Part 2 might be sort of a big deal. For me, it's not as big of a deal. I was a little bit thrown off that they didn't have that storyline at all, but then I actually read a quote by Denis Villeneuve and heard him talking about the subject and just addressing how hard it is to make these changes to the source material. But it definitely gave me some perspective on the whole situation. I'll read the clip now. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, he said, "When you adapt, there's always some kind of violence toward the original material. You have to change things. You have to bend. You have to make painful choices. One of the most painful choices for me on this one was Thufir Hawat. He's a character I absolutely love, but I decided right at the beginning that I was making a Bene Gesserit adaptation. That meant that Mentats are not as present as they should be, but it's the nature of the adaptation." And that really says it all to me, because Denis is a fan just like us. Thematically, he very much decided to highlight the faith side of this movie rather than the Mentat side of things. And I'm sure there is a world where they could have shown some scenes with the Baron and Thufir and included all of that, but that's not what Denis decided to do, and there really wasn't much in this movie that I felt like you could leave out. This movie felt like it had a very, very specific tone and a very, very specific voice, and it was all working together trying to achieve one thing. But let me know in the comments what you guys think about all that. It is kind of an interesting thing, you know, such a big part of the book being left out like that. But next would have to be, you know, this is a very, very big one, but next would have to be Alia Atreides. And this is the change that I think causes the most controversy that I've seen. There really hasn't been that much controversy surrounding this movie whatsoever. It's just been highly praised. But if there is any, the small amount that I have seen is regarding Alia. In the book, Paul's sister, Lady Jessica's daughter, is born and is about 2 years old, I think, at the end of it. And in this, obviously, she isn't born. They chose to condense the story and really make this all seem like one streamlined chain of events. There were no large time jumps, so there wasn't time enough to even show Alia's progress or even include the birth of Paul and Chani's son. In the book, Paul has a son that ends up passing away. Like, there's a lot of time that goes by, and Alia really is the actual abomination. I know that Paul is considered the abomination, but Alia is a very, very interesting character. The Water of Life gave her the powers of a Reverend mother just from birth. And fun fact, she actually is the one in the book that kills the Baron Harkonnen. She uses the little Gom Jabbar needle and pricks him, and he's like, ugh! And very quick side rant, just because I'm on that scene, I think that the way that Denis Villeneuve did that in Dune Part 2 with Paul walking in, the absolute power that he has walking into that room, the Sardaukar looking at him, the Emperor looking at him, Feyd-Rautha looking at him, but he doesn't acknowledge any of them, walks right by them, goes straight up to the Baron, acknowledges that he's his grandfather, and freaking stabs him. That was so so unbelievable to me. It was so cool. I loved that moment, and I thought if you were going to switch that moment in any way and change it, it worked a lot. So that's one little small example of how they changed the storyline from what Alia was doing in the book to what they ended up doing in the movie, and I thought it worked well. And they also still did include Alia. She was in a large portion of the movie. She was just talking to Jessica through the stomach, or they cast Anya Taylor-Joy in the vision that Paul is having, which now we know that Anya Taylor-Joy is going to be Alia in Dune Messiah, assuming that gets greenlit and that all happens. And so I think it's very exciting. I was fine with all the changes made to Alia. I felt like this was very much a Paul Atreides focused journey that we were on. He's very much the center focus, him as well as Chani in this movie. And in the book, there's a lot of jumping around. It's kind of like a big Game of Thrones. And although the story does end up revolving around Paul in the end, it's not like he's necessarily the main focus all the time, whereas he is in these movies. But like I said, I'm not going to address all of the changes in the film, but the last major one that I noticed that I want to talk about is Chani. I mean, this one is huge. In the book, Chani really just kind of stands with Paul in everything that he does. And the divide between the North and the South and the religious fundamentalist plot, it just isn't as much of a thing. And in the end, Chani doesn't end up leaving Paul. She stays with Paul as his concubine even after he takes the hand of Irulan. And I always found that interesting. They use that in the book as kind of a gateway to a relationship between Jessica and Chani, Jessica being a concubine of Duke Leto, and so they kind of have that in common. But in this, Chani is very headstrong. She doesn't bend or break. I love this, especially even just for Zendaya, because it really gave her a character arc as well as some virtue. She saw Paul's journey to becoming the quote-unquote Messiah for what it really was. She witnessed the methods of Jessica and all of that stuff, and then the heartbreak in the end as she watches the man that she loves go the direction that he does. It's insane. And I love how this part one starts with Chani when you watch the first movie, and now it ends with Chani at the end of part two. I thought the way that Denis handled her entire storyline was just beautiful, obviously omitting like her entire pregnancy. You know, she could be pregnant going off into the desert, we don't really know. But just the tension now between her and Irulan, and then the complicated feelings between her and Paul, it's unreal. Such good storytelling and such good adapting. As far as that change goes, I think that's the one that I'm easily the most on board with, like right away. But that's about it as far as the main difference that I've seen just the two times that I've watched this. Again, let me know down in the comments what you guys think about that. Now I just kind of want to take a second and dive into some of the best moments from this movie, as well as break down some of the themes. I think going into this thing, I expected greatness, but I don't think I expected the level of greatness for this movie to be on. It's a whole new level, and I'm sure you guys can agree. Even just from the beginning, the Harkonnens going anti-gravity with their suit and just like floating up that cliff face, the cinematography right away. Greg Fraser was already making his stamp on this movie, and it was just beautiful. And then the detail of the Fremen Sieges and the detail and their way of life, all those small little moments throughout the beginning of this movie were priceless. But the first big moment that I wanted to talk about was Lady Jessica becoming the Reverend Mother, her getting the water of life and all that. And to be honest, this was one of the scenes that when I was thinking about the movie and adapting it, I just didn't think of a way that they could pull this off. It's such a strange part of the novel. It has your head kind of spinning as to what's going on. You're like, gosh, the memories of all these different Reverend Mothers are now like coming into her mind. And then she's also pregnant with Alia, so all of that is going into Alia. And it's just this whole weird thing. I didn't know how they could possibly showcase that, but they do. Denis Villeneuve uses all of these cuts that were almost like, I don't even know, like Christopher Nolan-esque or something. These little quick shots of all of these different faces of all the Reverend Mothers that came before, showcasing all of them coming into Jessica's mind. And just the way that Rebecca Ferguson was able to capture that performance and really just make us feel the pain that she's in, as well as the sound design. It's kind of like bones breaking and blood vessels constricting, everything just getting so tight. And it was a very uncomfortable scene, and that's exactly how I felt when I read it. And so I thought they managed to pull that off great, as well as, you know, everybody realizing that she's pregnant and then everything going on from there. Like I said, I didn't think they'd be able to adapt that. And after that moment, it's really early on in the movie, I was just like, man, how is the rest of this movie gonna be? And it gets even better. You know, the next moment I'll talk about is Paul's first ride on Shai Hulud, his first time riding a sandworm. And man, I've seen some people in comments as well as people on Twitter being like, oh man, this movie looks so good, I can't wait to to watch it when it comes out on streaming. And no, don't, like, go to the theater right now, because moments like this is why you have to go to the theater and watch this movie. It's why this movie was made. The way that they seamlessly adapted this ride, it had me on the absolute edge of my seat, and it's breathtaking. I'd compare it to the pod race from Phantom Menace. It's kind of a strange comparison, but even better than that. Something that makes you, when you're in the movie theater, literally feel like standing up and cheering. I say that because my mom actually did that when we were watching Phantom Menace for the first time as a family in theaters, and we've made fun of her till this day for that. I'm sorry, Mom. But the way that Paul falls through the sand, and as he's falling, he's trying to cling on to the worm, and he finally gets on it, and the music is booming, and then he eventually catches it, and he stands up, and just that feeling of joy, it's overwhelming. There's so much shock and awe when you're watching that with a bunch of other people in the audience. You can just feel how tense it is in the room, and I love that stuff. I love sitting in a theater for that stuff. But the next scene, well, it's tough. I think I would have to say that this is my favorite little bit in the movie. I'm talking about the introduction of Feyd-Rautha, and the way they showcase how messed up his character is from the jump, stabbing this girl a bunch of times and killing another, and he has these little cannibal darlings, he calls them, but more specifically, just the entire gladiator sequence. If you didn't know, this entire sequence was shot in IMAX infrared lenses, and Denis Villeneuve has actually said this about it. I found it really interesting. He said, "I explained to the studio, we shoot it this way, and there's no way we can go back." They signed with their blood, but it created a very powerful, eerie feeling that I love. And we freaking love it too, dude. But it really gives this whole little bit the craziest feeling in the world. The fact that this is the light that their sun gives off, and there's like these ink fireworks going off, and there's this packed arena. I also like how they included the fact that they typically drug these fighters. That's something I found very interesting in the book, and they included that, but the Baron asked them not to drug one of them. And you can tell that Austin Butler worked his ass off for this role. The combat and his voice and the little mannerisms, this is some of the best villainy that I've seen in recent memory, at least, and I just love when the movie takes this turn. We get the next little bit with Léa Seydoux, that Bene Gesserit seducing him, and it's all just so dark and twisted and otherworldly. I love the aesthetic of all of it, and Feyd-Rautha is just, can we just all agree he's the coolest character that we've ever seen or ever seen? I don't know, maybe that's just me, I don't know. I just absolutely loved that little middle section of the movie. It blew me away, and you know, from there, oh my gosh, there's so many individual moments in the last hour of this movie that really revolve solely around one character. And so let's just talk about it all. Let's talk about Paul Atreides and the turning point of this film. Paul has the vision sort of skewed in his mind clearly by Jessica, but convincing him to drink the water of life, or at least showing him that he has to drink the water of life. And from that point on, it's an absolute roller coaster. He's against the religious zealot stuff for a while, and then he's sort of on the edge, on the precipice of it, and then he realizes that the only way through this, and the only way to achieve his goal, is to embrace it. Gurney's telling him to do it. Obviously, Stilgar is fanboying in the corner telling him to do it. The only real voice that's telling him not to do this, or the only real voice of reason in this situation, is Chani. She's the only one trying to convince Paul not to lose himself in this situation. But once he makes that decision, there's no going back. And the prophecy does end up unfolding exactly how it was foretold. And so you get the sense that eventually Paul starts to turn towards truly believing that he is the Messiah. And these are the moments where Denis Villeneuve and Greg Fraser absolutely thrive. Some of the most powerful imagery is used to show us the level that Paul has now risen to. You get these overhead shots, you get him walking amongst these Fremen, and then there is this council moment where Paul is speaking to all of the Fremen, and I swear this could get Timothée Chalamet an Oscar. I mean, at least to me, this performance was so powerful for me, and the second time I watched it, it was even more powerful. I can't wait to watch it again. Just the command that he demands, seeing the past and showing that he is a hand of God. He is the Lisan al-Gaib. This was the moment in the film for me when it went from great to goat. The shots of him walking in the distance with a giant sandworm behind him, and then you get to the duel, you get to the final battle and all of that stuff. There's so many really cool sequences involved with all of that, but I already mentioned the whole Baron scene when he walks in, and just the eeriness of him walking into that space, the way that Feyd-Rautha is kind of like checking him out and looking at him and kind of smirking at him, like as he's killing the Baron. But then he walks out, and you know that we're eventually going to get to that meeting, and the way that they ended up going about this scene, having it at sunrise, so having the entire battle go through the night. We see Gurney and Beast Robin have their little final duel, and then we get to the morning. A new day rises, and it's a new day for everybody, because now Muad'Dib is here. Now the Lisan al-Gaib is here, and he calls everybody into his presence, and he challenges the Emperor, and some of these moments were just so powerful. Obviously, there's the duel between him and Feyd-Rautha, and this is some of the best hand-to-hand combat that I think we've seen in quite some time. Obviously, there's so many cool action sequences in so many different movies, but the meaning behind this duel, that challenge for power, and something that I see a lot of people mention these days between television as well as film is the show don't tell rule. Filmmakers and writers who feel obligated to say every little thing that's happening to the audience as if we can't figure it out ourselves. But Denis Villeneuve is very much a visual director. He stated that he would love to make a movie without any dialogue because he hates dialogue. And that's what I love the most about this final scene. There are moments within this duel, for instance, when Feyd-Rautha looks at Chani and he's like, "Is this your pet?" And he turns to Paul and he's trying to get a rise out of Paul, and Paul just says absolutely nothing. It stays silence, but due to the gestures that Timothée Chalamet makes, he kind of squares his stance, and you know that the fight's back on. Nothing had to be said in that moment, as well as after the fight, when he goes up to the Emperor and he demands that he kneels. It's not like he says out loud, "I demand you to kneel right now, and I just defeated your champion," and blah, blah, blah. All he does is stomp his foot, and all of us know what he's saying. And Denis Villeneuve knows that the audience is smart enough to understand all of that stuff. And I swear, this final duel was it was one of the coolest things. Obviously, in the book, it's one of the coolest things as well. It's what everything's leading up to, and it is that moment. I was very curious how they were going to handle it, and it was absolutely flawless. The one thing I think I'm remembering correctly, I think that Feyd-Rautha gets stabbed in the head in the book. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering that correctly. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's something that I was kind of expecting, and they didn't do. But it all led to the line, had he gotten stabbed in the head, he couldn't have said, "You fought well, Atreides." And that echoes the line that he said to the other Atreides when he killed him in the arena. He kills him and he says, "You fought well, Atreides." And he says it again in the end. And I just love the black and white kind of back and forth of that, the symmetry there. Oh, it was absolutely beautiful. But I truly could talk all day about this film. There are so many more moments that I could just rant and rant about. But I think the final thing that I just want to discuss is just the turn of Paul Atreides and what this means for the future with Dune Messiah. After Frank Herbert's Dune was written, Dune Messiah was something that Frank Herbert almost felt obligated to make because people weren't understanding what this meant. And I think it's kind of up for debate right now whether the audience is understanding what they're getting at here, because it's very easy to perceive this first story as Paul Atreides being Luke Skywalker. Paul Atreides is here to save the galaxy, and he is the ultimate hero. But the story that it's actually trying to tell is more of an Anakin Skywalker story. It's a cautionary tale, and I think Denis Villeneuve manages to sneak subtly a lot of that into this ending. There are dark undertones to everything that Paul is doing in the end. It doesn't feel as heroic as it should. You're kind of like, gosh, this is awesome, but is this right? It's pretty amazing that he defeats the Harkonnens, right? It's pretty amazing that he gets his revenge, but the clear difference there is already highlighted earlier in the movie. Jessica says, "Your father didn't believe in revenge," and Paul says, "Well, I do." And he gets that revenge, but at what cost? What are they going to do? Wasn't this all just about freeing Arrakis? Well, now Arrakis is fine, but now you're under siege from all of the other great houses, so what is he now going to do? Is he now going to become kind of the dictator that he fears? These are all questions that are looming. These are all questions that are out there. In the book, Dune Messiah very, very much answers those questions, but that's what a third movie would be. And so I'm curious to see how you took that information if you saw Dune Part 2 and how it was presented to you if you didn't read the book and what you were thinking of Paul this entire time. There's a lot of different ways that people can take the movie's interpretation of this, and there's a lot of different ways that you can take the book because there's so many different things happening. It's very complicated, and that's what's so freaking awesome and epic about this story. It has these very strong characters that we can attach ourselves to, but we can also apply it to real world situations having to do with politics and faith and science and war. It's such an amazing story on such a grand scale. So yeah, guys, I mean, that's pretty much it for this breakdown. That was a lot of information, but I'm happy to be talking about this. Honestly, I'm going to go see Dune Part 2 several more times. It's one of my favorites. I'll definitely be covering it more on the channel here, so keep an eye out for that. But please let me know down in the comments what you guys thought about, one, just the differences between the book and the movie, if you read the book, but also just what did you think of Dune Part 2? Did you like the movie as much as I did? Did you not like it? Why didn't you like it? You know, all of those different reasons. I'd love to read your comments. I read every single one that comes in. So also, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you smash the like button, subscribe if you're new here. You can follow me on X at Jones Vibes Only, and don't forget to keep up the good vibes, guys. But Dune Part 2 is here, and now a huge question is, will we get Dune Messiah?